Black Janitor's secret invention saves hospital. Bosses regret firing him. Michael was a black janitor at the hospital, constantly overlooked, mocked, and treated as invisible by those around him. Every day, he quietly cleaned the floors and emptied trash bins, never once earning a second glance from the doctors, nurses, or management. To them, he was just a janitor, nothing more. But what they didn't know was that Michael had a secret. When a major crisis struck the hospital, a vital system failure threatening patient safety, chaos erupted. The doctors and engineers couldn't figure out the problem, and panic started to spread. That's when Michael, the man everyone had dismissed, stepped forward with a shocking offer to fix the situation. Everyone laughed. How could a janitor, someone they barely acknowledged, possibly solve a problem that experts couldn't? But Michael wasn't just any janitor. His mind was sharp, and he had been quietly working on something they could never have imagined. A simple yet brilliant invention. As the clock ticked down, Michael's invention saved the day, stopping the crisis in its tracks. Now, the very people who had disregarded him were left speechless. Michael had shown them all. Brilliance doesn't come with a title, it comes from within. The night had fallen over the hospital, and while the world outside was fast asleep, the dimly lit halls of Oakwood Medical Center remained busy. Inside, Michael shuffled quietly through the corridor, his mop dragging behind him, his eyes scanning the floors for any speck of dust or debris. He had worked here for years, long enough to know the rhythm of the hospital. The frantic pace, the rush of doctors and nurses who never stopped moving, the endless clamor of machines and monitors. Michael had always been the one to clean up the messes others left behind. But no one had ever really looked at him. Not until tonight. As he wiped the floor, his mind wandered. Michael wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't just the man who made sure the hospital stayed spotless. He had skills that no one knew about. Things that had never been recognized or valued. He'd spent years tinkering with broken machines, fixing things on his own time, not for praise, but out of sheer curiosity. But no one cared. In a world that saw titles before people, Michael was nothing more than a broom and dustpan, nothing more than the invisible man who kept the hospital clean. What they didn't know was that Michael had built things that could save lives. He had inventions, solutions, but the world had never given him the chance to show them. That was about to change. The hospital had been running smoothly for most of the evening, but a series of unfortunate events began to unfold quietly in the background. The air filtration system, crucial for keeping the operating room sterile, had malfunctioned. No one noticed it at first, except Michael. He had been cleaning in the ICU when he heard the unmistakable hum of a broken system. The sterile air, which kept everything from operating room instruments to the very air the doctors breathed clean, had begun to falter. It was subtle at first, but Michael's sharp ears caught the change immediately. He turned to the control panel at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the dials and switches. The screen was flashing an alert. Something was wrong. A deep, gnawing feeling twisted in his gut. He knew that if it wasn't fixed, things could go terribly wrong. Surgical rooms could be contaminated, patients could get infections, surgeries could be delayed. The stakes were high, but no one else seemed to notice. Michael knew the hospital couldn't afford another catastrophe, not now. And yet, no one had noticed. He wasn't just a janitor in their eyes. He was invisible. His skills were dismissed, his opinions never considered. The engineers had been busy on other projects, the doctors too preoccupied to care. Michael took a deep breath. He could fix this. He had done it before, just not in a hospital setting. The first step was to find the source. He knew the system well enough to pinpoint where the issue lay. There were pipes running through the walls, pipes no one ever bothered to check. He'd seen this kind of problem before, back when he'd worked on a similar system at the old hospital in another town. But that had been years ago, and no one had cared enough to recognize his potential back then, either. Still, he couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about him proving something. It was about saving lives. The problem wasn't just the HVAC system. The backup power system, the one that kept the hospital from shutting down in emergencies, was unstable. A critical malfunction. Michael's mind raced. He knew exactly how to fix it, but there was one problem. No one was going to let a janitor take over a job like this. At that moment, the door to the control room burst open. The hospital's lead engineer, Thomas, a man in his early 50s with a reputation for knowing everything about everything, walked in. He was flanked by Dr. Fields, the chief surgeon, and a few others who were trying to get a handle on the situation. Panic was evident in their faces. "This is bad, real bad," Thomas muttered, looking at the flashing screen. "We can't risk contaminating the surgical rooms." His voice was shaky, but Michael could see the helplessness in his eyes. They didn't have a solution yet. "Could we just bypass the system?" Dr. Fields asked, rubbing his temples in frustration. "We've tried everything. The backup isn't functioning, and the main system is starting to fail," Thomas replied. "We'll have to shut down several rooms and delay the surgeries." Michael stepped forward, quietly but firmly, his voice calm. "I can fix it." They all turned to him, their expressions a mix of surprise and disbelief. Michael was used to it. He'd seen it before. Thomas's brow furrowed. You're just a janitor, Michael. This is above your pay grade." Michael didn't flinch. He knew the weight of their judgment, but he also knew he had the answer. "I can do it," he repeated. His voice was steady, his hands gripping the edge of the control panel, his heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. For a moment, there was silence. They exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or take him seriously. But as the seconds ticked by and the panic in the room grew more intense, something shifted. They had no other options. They were running out of time. "Fine," Thomas said, reluctantly stepping aside. "Show us what you've got." What followed was a blur of activity. Michael worked quickly, opening up the panel, his hands moving with a precision that shocked everyone in the room. He knew exactly what to do. His years of fixing old machinery, building gadgets out of spare parts, and solving problems no one else could see had all led to this moment. It was simple, really, but it required the kind of creativity and resourcefulness no one expected from a janitor. He bypassed the faulty system, rerouted the air filtration system to a backup engine, and patched the backup power lines with spare wires he'd kept hidden in his utility cart for emergencies. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Within minutes, the alarm stopped ringing, the system stabilized, and the air was fresh again. "Michael," Dr. Field said, his voice filled with awe. "How did you?" "It's a simple fix," Michael replied, shrugging. "Just took a little creativity and some spare parts." The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the now-functioning systems. Thomas stared at Michael, still processing what had just happened. "You saved us," he said, his voice small but full of disbelief. "We would have been screwed without you." Michael nodded, his face still calm. "It's nothing." But to Michael, it wasn't nothing. It was everything. In that moment, he proved to himself, and to them, that he was more than just a janitor. He wasn't invisible. The days that followed were a blur of gratitude and regret from the hospital staff. Michael had done the impossible. But the higher-ups? They didn't even acknowledge what he had done, not at first. He went back to his mopping and his cleaning, his face still hidden behind the uniform they thought defined him. But inside, Michael knew he had made a difference. The irony was inescapable. The very people who had dismissed him, the doctors, the engineers, the people who thought they knew it all, were the ones who were left speechless, their pride humbled by the janitor they had once so easily ignored. Michael smiled to himself. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about something far more important, showing them all that greatness doesn't come from a title. It comes from who you are. And Michael was finally starting to show them who he really was. The sharp hum of the hospital's HVAC system had always been a reassuring sound. It signified that everything was functioning. Air circulating through sterile rooms, keeping the atmosphere clean, keeping patients safe. But tonight, the familiar hum turned to a faint buzz, then a sickly, grinding noise, before finally falling silent. It was a soft sound at first, barely noticeable over the usual chaos of the hospital, but soon, it became clear. The system was failing. Michael, sweeping the floor in the ICU, glanced up at the ceiling as the air grew thick and heavy. He could feel it, a subtle difference in the air pressure, a warmth that was out of place for the normally sterile, chilled environment. His instincts kicked in. He had seen this kind of malfunction before, but this time, it felt different. The HVAC system wasn't just an ordinary machine. It was the lifeblood of the hospital's sterile environment. Without it, the surgical suites would be contaminated, infections would spread, and surgeries would be at risk. It was the one thing that kept patients safe, kept them breathing clean air, kept the hospital running smoothly. Without it, everything was about to fall apart. And Michael knew it. even before the alarms went off. The first shrill alarm came seconds after the system failed completely, echoing through the hallways. Panic spread quickly. Nurses and doctors began shouting orders, scrambling to check patients, make sure the sterile environments were still intact. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a full-scale emergency. The hospital couldn't operate without its HVAC system functioning, and with every second that ticked by, the risks increased. A team of engineers arrived almost immediately. They were the experts, the people who were supposed to know how to fix the problem. But Michael watched them, standing in the hallway, as they huddled around the control panel, their brows furrowed in frustration. They were testing, checking, adjusting, but nothing seemed to work. The system was stubborn, refusing to cooperate, and the more they tried, the worse it seemed to get. "We need a fix, fast," one of the engineers shouted to his team, his voice barely audible over the rising panic. A nurse rushed past them, her face white with worry. "What's going on? Can we still do the surgeries?" The engineer didn't have an answer. They didn't know what was wrong, and they didn't know how to fix it. As time passed, the situation began to escalate. A frantic meeting was called in the administration offices. Hospital leadership gathered, doctors, department heads, engineers, and a wave of panic swept over the room. They had patients on the operating tables, some in critical condition, others scheduled for life-saving surgeries. But the sterile conditions they relied on were in jeopardy. Delays were inevitable. "This is bad," Dr. Roberts, the head of surgery, said, staring at the floor. "If we don't fix this soon, we'll have to delay every surgery scheduled for today. We can't risk operating in contaminated conditions." The room was tense, the air thick with fear. The situation was spiraling out of control. Patients' lives were on the line, and the leadership had no solution. They were trapped in a corner, desperate for answers. "We need to call in external help. Get someone from outside," one of the engineers suggested. "Maybe they'll have a fresh set of eyes." But time was running out. Every minute that passed without a solution meant more risk, more delays, more danger for the patients. The clock was ticking, and no one had any answers. Michael could hear the commotion from down the hall. The leadership meeting, the frantic energy of the staff, the ringing of phones as external experts were called in. But no one seemed to notice him. He wasn't important enough to be included in those conversations. He was just the janitor, the man who cleaned up after others, the one who moved in the background unnoticed. But as the minutes passed, Michael's mind raced. He had worked in this hospital long enough to know every inch of it, every system, every machine. He had seen the engineers work their magic on complicated equipment, but he had also spent years fixing broken things on his own, things that others thought were beyond repair. He wasn't just a janitor. He was resourceful, sharp, and observant. He had seen the cracks in the system, the small inconsistencies that others had missed. The HVAC was failing, but Michael knew that the solution wasn't about complex tools or expensive equipment. It was something simpler, something that could be fixed with the right knowledge and the right hands. He stood by the control panel, watching the engineers fumble, checking the screen for any error messages. No one noticed him at first, but Michael didn't mind. He had seen the problem, and he knew exactly what had gone wrong. The wiring was faulty. One of the major connections had shorted out, cutting off the signal to the system's backup. The engineers hadn't seen it because they were too focused on the technical parts. Michael took a deep breath, walking towards the panel, and then, without saying a word, he reached for the wires. The engineers looked up, startled. "What are you doing?" one of them asked, his tone sharp, confused. "I know what's wrong," Michael said quietly. "I can fix it." The engineers exchanged uncertain glances, but no one stopped him. What else could they do? The system was failing, and nothing else had worked. Michael stepped up to the panel, his fingers moving quickly. He reconnected the wires with ease, bypassing the malfunctioning component, and just as he had expected, the system came back online. The hum returned. The room fell silent. It wasn't an immediate fix, but the pressure slowly began to ease. The temperature in the hospital returned to normal. The system was working again, the air was clean, and the risk of contamination was averted. The engineers stood there, stunned, watching Michael with a mix of disbelief and admiration. You fixed it?" one of the engineers finally asked, his voice thick with awe. Michael nodded, wiping his hands on his uniform, his face calm as ever. "I did what needed to be done." The leadership, still in the middle of their crisis management meeting, quickly received the news. The HVAC system had been restored. Their worst fears had been avoided. The surgery rooms were safe, and operations could continue. For the first time in hours, there was a collective sigh of relief. The hospital was back on track. The patients were safe. The crisis had been averted. But Michael didn't stick around for the thanks. He didn't want the spotlight. He wasn't there to receive recognition. He was there to do his job. The truth was, he hadn't expected anyone to notice. But they did. As he walked back down the hall, the whispers started. The engineers were talking about him. The nurses, the doctors, everyone was talking about the janitor who had saved the day. Michael smiled to himself, but he didn't let the praise get to him. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about knowing that he had done something that no one else could. That, to him, was enough. The storm had passed. But for Michael, the real work had just begun. The chaos in the hospital continued to swell as the engineers scrambled to get the HVAC system back online. The temperature in the operating rooms had started to climb, the air quality was falling, and the panic in the air was palpable. Doctors and nurses exchanged worried looks, their hands busy with patients, while the engineers were stuck, helpless in front of a malfunctioning system. Everyone was on edge, desperate for a solution that wasn't coming. For Michael, though, it wasn't chaos. It was just another problem to solve. He stood quietly in the background, watching the engineers work, his mind racing with ideas. He had spent his life working on things, small gadgets, household repairs, and forgotten devices. His hands had always been busy, fixing things that others had dismissed as broken beyond repair. That was his life. He was always overlooked, his skills never given a second thought. But this time was different. The engineers, panicked and frustrated, were already discussing external solutions, talking about expensive contractors who could come in and take care of the problem. They had the expertise, but their solutions came with a price, and time was running out. The more they discussed, the more Michael's frustration grew. He knew this system better than any contractor could. When no one was paying attention, Michael stepped forward. He cleared his throat, loud enough for the engineers to hear, but quiet enough not to disturb the chaos of the room. The engineers paused, glancing at him as if he had just walked into a meeting he wasn't invited to. "I think I can fix it," Michael said, his voice steady but low. The engineers looked at each other, then back at Michael. The room fell silent for a moment. One of the engineers, a tall man with glasses, snorted in disbelief. "You? No offense, Michael, but you're the janitor. What could you possibly know about fixing an HVAC system?" he scoffed, as if the very idea was laughable. Michael didn't flinch. He had heard this before. He had spent his life hearing the same dismissive tone from people who saw his role and didn't think twice about his skills. But Michael wasn't there for validation. He wasn't there to prove anything. He was there to fix the problem. "I've worked here for years," Michael replied calmly, his eyes focused on the broken control panel in front of the engineers. "I know this hospital better than anyone. I've seen the system at its worst, and I've worked on it before. I'm not just a janitor. I've fixed things for years, things most people never even notice. I can fix this." The engineers exchanged doubtful glances, the skepticism obvious in their eyes. Michael saw it, but he didn't let it discourage him. He knew they were desperate, and that desperation might just give him the chance he needed. "All right, then," one of the engineers said, shrugging as if it didn't matter whether or not Michael succeeded. "If you think you can do it, go ahead. But don't expect us to waste any time waiting if this doesn't work." Michael nodded. "I won't waste any time." He moved quickly, not waiting for another word. He had seen this problem before. He knew exactly where the issue lay. It wasn't just a broken part. It was a combination of things. He had spent enough time cleaning and maintaining the hospital's machinery to know that these systems were complex but not beyond reach. He walked over to the nearby maintenance room, scanning the shelves for parts. He grabbed a few simple tools, nothing fancy, just the basics that he'd accumulated over the years. There was no need for expensive gadgets or high-tech equipment. Michael's strength lay in his creativity. He could see the solution in his mind, and now it was time to bring it to life. The camera zooms in on his face. His eyes are focused, determined, but there's something humble about him, something unassuming. He wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't care if anyone believed in him. He was going to fix this because it was what needed to be done, and that was all that mattered. With the tools in hand, Michael made his way back to the control panel, where the engineers were still huddled, watching him with disbelief. They didn't understand. They didn't know him the way he knew himself. But it didn't matter. Michael was going to prove them wrong. He opened the panel, inspecting the wires and connections inside. The system was more intricate than he remembered, but it wasn't impossible. Michael had worked with machines before. He knew how to listen to them, how to figure out what they were trying to tell him. The engineers were quiet now, watching him closely. Some looked skeptical, some were starting to show signs of curiosity. But Michael didn't care about their doubts. He had his eyes set on the solution. The next few minutes were tense. Michael's hands moved with precision, his fingers tracing the wires, reconnecting parts, and adjusting the system with a gentle but confident touch. The room was still, save for the occasional rustle of the engineers shifting their weight, the sound of Michael working tirelessly in front of them. Every now and then, Michael paused to double-check his work, but he was steady, focused. He wasn't afraid to make mistakes. He'd made plenty in his time tinkering with devices. But he had learned from each failure. That's what made him good at what he did. He wasn't afraid to try again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Michael stood up. He stepped back from the panel, taking a deep breath. The engineers were still watching, unsure of what would happen next. The moment of truth had arrived. He reached for the control panel's power switch and flicked it on. The room held its breath. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a hum, the HVAC system came back to life. The fans kicked in, the air started circulating again, and the sterile environment returned to normal. The engineers froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. The system was functioning perfectly. Michael's invention wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't some groundbreaking technology that would make headlines. It was simple, but it was exactly what the hospital needed to get back on track. He stood there, waiting for the engineers to speak. When they finally did, their voices were full of awe. I don't believe it, one of the engineers said. You actually fixed it. You saved us. Michael shrugged, his face calm. I told you I could. The engineers were speechless. They had spent hours trying to fix the problem, bringing in all their expertise, but it was the janitor, the man they had written off, who had solved the issue in a fraction of the time. It wasn't about the technology, it wasn't about the tools. It was about the ingenuity and resourcefulness that Michael had always possessed, even when no one had ever seen it. The camera pulls back, showing the engineers, their eyes wide with surprise, and Michael, standing there quietly, his work done. He hadn't done it for the praise, but the respect in their eyes was enough for him. I guess we owe you one. Thomas, one of the engineers, said quietly. Michael gave a small nod, not looking for a reward. Just doing my job. But deep down, Michael knew something had changed. He hadn't just fixed a machine. He had shown them all that there was more to him than they had ever imagined. The quiet janitor, the man no one had ever paid attention to, had just become the hospital's most unlikely hero. And for Michael, that was enough. The silence in the room was deafening as the HVAC system hummed back to life. The once lifeless air, thick with anxiety, began to clear. The temperature normalized, the sterile conditions were restored, and a collective sigh of relief spread through the hospital. Nurses moved with renewed confidence, surgeons returned to their posts, and the frantic energy of the past hours began to ebb away. The crisis had been averted, thanks to Michael. The control room, where the engineers had gathered, had transformed from a place of desperation to one of stunned silence. Their eyes remained glued to the control panel as the system stabilized, watching with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. What had once seemed like an insurmountable problem was now nothing more than a momentary blip on the radar, and all because of Michael, the janitor. Michael stood in the corner, quietly observing. His work was done, and now the weight of the moment began to settle in. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't even looking for acknowledgement. The system was back online. The hospital was safe. That was all that mattered. Yet, as he turned to walk away, the murmurs behind him grew louder. The engineers were talking, their voices low but full of disbelief. How did he do that? One whispered. I've never seen anything like it, another murmured. He's a janitor, the first engineer said again, as if trying to convince himself. How the hell did he know how to fix all that? But Michael didn't stay to hear their comments. He moved through the hospital halls with quiet determination, his face unchanged. As he walked past the nurse's station, he could feel their eyes on him. The whispers started there, too. It didn't matter how much he had helped. They still saw him as just the janitor, nothing more. Back in the executive offices, the management team had gathered in their conference room. The tension was palpable. The situation had been critical, and the outcome was far from certain. They had faced a crisis of their own, one that could have cost them everything, and now they had to deal with the fallout. They had narrowly avoided catastrophe, but it was the question of how that weighed heavily on their minds. Dr. Roberts, the head surgeon, had just finished giving his report, his voice steady but still filled with the tension of the past few hours. We've stabilized. The patients are safe. The operating rooms are good to go. We're back on track, he said, rubbing his face tiredly. But we need to address how this was handled. The room fell silent as the hospital CEO, Mr. Anderson, leaned forward in his chair, looking over the data on the screen. His eyes flicked to the faces around the table, his fingers tapping the table nervously. Everyone is safe. But how did we not see this coming? Mr. Anderson asked, his voice sharp. How did the engineers not catch this earlier? How was this allowed to get to the point it did? The CEO's frustration was evident, but there was something else in his eyes, something deeper. His gaze moved from one person to another in the room, until it landed on Thomas, the lead engineer. Thomas, you're in charge of maintenance. You've been here for years. How could this happen under your watch? Thomas, who had been silent up until that point, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out right. He couldn't defend himself, not after what had just happened. His head hung low in embarrassment. It shouldn't have happened, sir. I don't know what went wrong. I've never seen this kind of malfunction before. We tried everything we could, he explained, his voice trailing off. Mr. Anderson shook his head, clearly frustrated, but then his gaze shifted toward the door. Through the glass windows, he could see Michael walking down the hall, the janitor who had fixed the problem. He stood there for a moment, his expression hardening as he thought back to how he had dismissed Michael in the past, how he had never taken him seriously, how he had assumed Michael was nothing more than a lowly janitor, someone who didn't deserve to be involved in the decision-making process. It was a bitter pill for him to swallow. Michael had stepped forward when no one else could. He had saved the hospital, and yet, he was the last person anyone would have expected to be capable of such a thing. The tension in the room reached its peak when Mr. Anderson finally stood up, his face flushed with a mix of frustration and regret. He pushed his chair back, the sound of it scraping across the floor echoing in the quiet room. Get him in here, he ordered. His voice had a cold edge to it, one that hadn't been there when they had been discussing the issue earlier. It was a voice filled with something Michael had never heard from him before, respect. Moments later, Michael was standing in front of the conference room door, looking almost out of place in his janitorial uniform, his hands still a little stained from his work. He hesitated for a second before pushing open the door, his eyes meeting the eyes of the management team inside. Michael, come in, Mr. Anderson said, his voice now calm, even apologetic. Michael stepped in slowly, his movements deliberate. The engineers who had doubted him, the doctors who had underestimated him, all of them were sitting there, waiting. As he took a seat, the CEO spoke first, his tone more sincere than Michael had ever heard. Michael, he began, choosing his words carefully, I want to personally thank you for your work. You've saved this hospital today. The words felt strange coming from Mr. Anderson's lips, and Michael could tell he was trying hard to make up for the earlier dismissal. But the apology wasn't what mattered to Michael. It wasn't the thanks, it wasn't the recognition, it was the realization that they had all been wrong about him. Mr. Anderson continued, I'll be honest. I've overlooked you. We all have. But I've seen today what we should have seen all along. You're not just a janitor, Michael. You're an inventor. You're resourceful, you're skilled, and you've proven to us that we've been wrong in how we've treated you. Michael listened quietly, his face calm, his hands resting in his lap. The words felt good, but they felt too late. They should have seen him for who he was long before today. But still, he nodded politely. I did what needed to be done, he said, his voice steady. The hospital needed help. I'm just glad I could help. Thomas, who had been quietly watching the exchange, looked at Michael with a deep sense of regret. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice shaky. I'm sorry, Michael. I doubted you. I didn't see what you were capable of. You saved all of us, and I should have believed in you from the start. Michael nodded again, his expression unchanged. "It's okay," he said simply. "I'm just doing my job." But the room was thick with the weight of what had happened. Michael had saved the day, but it wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about the realization that the hospital, the people he had worked alongside for so long, had completely missed his potential. He had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed until now. Mr. Anderson took a deep breath and looked around the room. The regret in his eyes was obvious, but there was something else there, too, an understanding. "From now on, Michael," he said, his voice firm but warm, "we will make sure we never overlook someone like you again. Your skills are invaluable. You're part of this team, whether we ever realized it or not. I'll be recommending that you get the recognition you deserve, and more." Michael stood up, the weight of the moment finally settling over him. He had done what no one thought he could do, and in the process, he had shown them all who he truly was. Not just a janitor, but an inventor, a problem solver, and an unsung hero. "I appreciate that," Michael said, his voice humble. "But I don't need recognition. I just need to do my job." The management team exchanged glances, clearly moved by his words. They had underestimated him, but now they knew better. Michael wasn't just a janitor. He was the heart of the hospital. As Michael turned to leave the room, a part of him knew that this moment was more than just about fixing the HVAC system. It was about proving that talent could never be measured by a title. His worth had always been there, hidden in plain sight. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to show it. And now, that moment had come. The hospital was still buzzing with activity in the aftermath of the crisis. Despite the fact that everything had returned to normal, there was an underlying current of change in the air. The leadership had convened in their usual boardroom, but today, their discussions were filled with something that hadn't been there before: regret. They had been blindsided by Michael, the janitor, the man they had all but ignored. What was supposed to be a simple meeting to discuss how to prevent another disaster had turned into something much deeper. They could no longer ignore what Michael had done, what he had shown them. He had proven that true talent didn't come with a title. It came from within. Dr. Roberts, who had been at the heart of the crisis, cleared his throat and addressed the group. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Michael saved us. He wasn't just the janitor. He was the one who had the answer all along. How did we miss that? How did we not see that he could fix something we couldn't?" The room was quiet as the leadership team exchanged glances. No one had an answer. There were no excuses. The truth was undeniable. Michael had solved the problem when everyone else had failed. And that was a bitter pill to swallow for those who had brushed him off for years. Mr. Anderson, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, looking more introspective than usual. His face was serious, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had overlooked Michael for too long, and now he knew he couldn't just let this moment pass. "I think it's time we admit something," Mr. Anderson began, his voice steady but regretful. "We were wrong about Michael. I was wrong about him. We've always seen him as just the janitor, just someone to clean up after us. But he's shown us he's much more than that. We owe him an apology, and we owe him an opportunity." There was a collective murmur of agreement around the table. The realization had hit them hard, and now they had to face the consequences of their blind spots. The hospital had a talent they had never recognized, and it was time to make it right. A few minutes later, Michael was called into the meeting room. He had been working quietly, as usual, staying out of the spotlight and focusing on his tasks. But now, he had been summoned, and he had no idea what awaited him. As he entered the room, the leadership team stood in unison, a sign of respect he had never seen from them before. The atmosphere in the room was different. There was no tension, no judgment, just an acknowledgement of something he had always known but never had the chance to prove. "Michael," Mr. Anderson began, his voice firm but humble, "I want to personally apologize for the way you've been treated here. For too long, we've dismissed you, underestimated you, and never truly saw your worth. But you've shown us, in the most unexpected way, the value of your talent. You saved this hospital. You saved lives. And for that, we are deeply grateful." Michael stood there, still, his expression calm. He wasn't one for attention, and he certainly wasn't used to this kind of recognition. His hands were slightly trembling, but he did his best to keep his composure. He wasn't looking for praise. He had just done what needed to be done. Mr. Anderson continued, his voice softer now. "We want to make it right. We'd like to offer you your job back, and this time, we'd like to promote you. You're not just a janitor, Michael. You're a vital part of this hospital, and we want to acknowledge that. We want to give you a position that reflects your talents, your ingenuity, and your contribution to this hospital. Michael's mind raced. This was more than he had ever expected. A promotion? Recognition? He had never imagined this moment. Never dreamed that the people who had always looked down on him would suddenly see him as someone important. But as he looked around the room, he could see the sincerity in their eyes. They had learned something that couldn't be taken back. You don't have to do this, Michael said quietly, his voice steady but humble. I didn't do it for the promotion. I just did my job. The hospital needed help, and I was the one who could fix it. That's all that matters. Mr. Anderson smiled, the weight of the situation lifting slightly. We understand that. But we've come to realize that what you did goes far beyond what was expected of you. You've shown us the kind of person you are, and we can't let that go unnoticed. There was a brief silence in the room as Michael absorbed the weight of their words. It was a lot to take in, but he wasn't one for making a scene. He nodded slowly, accepting their apology without the need for more words. He wasn't there to make a statement. He was just there to do what needed to be done. But it felt good to know that they had seen him for who he truly was. After a few more moments of discussion, the leadership team made their final decision. They were offering Michael a position, an important one that would acknowledge his talents and allow him to work alongside the engineers, maintaining the hospital's crucial systems and offering his expertise where it was needed most. They were also planning to send him to training to further develop his skills. It was an acknowledgement that went beyond a simple apology. It was a recognition of the potential they had overlooked for far too long. As the meeting ended, Michael stood up, his heart a little heavier than usual. He wasn't sure what this promotion would mean for him, but he knew one thing. The hospital had changed. And so had he. As he walked back to his station, his heart still processing the gravity of what had just happened, Michael couldn't help but smile. He hadn't been looking for a promotion. He hadn't been looking for recognition. He had simply wanted to do his job, and in the process, he had shown everyone something more important, the value of recognizing talent, no matter where it comes from. And as he continued his work, Michael knew that this was just the beginning. The hospital had changed, yes, but so had he. He had proven to himself, and to them, that greatness isn't measured by titles or job descriptions. It's measured by the actions you take, the decisions you make, and the impact you have on the world around you. Michael wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was someone they could rely on, someone they would never overlook again. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. It was a quiet victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The days that followed Michael's unexpected intervention were quiet in the halls of Oakwood Medical Center. Life had returned to a sense of normalcy. Surgeries were happening on schedule, patients were recovering, and the hospital staff resumed their routines. Yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. It wasn't just the HVAC system that had been repaired. It was the very way the hospital viewed its staff, its people, and, most importantly, its unseen heroes. In the break rooms, whispers of Michael's brilliance had spread. Nurses who had once walked past him without a second glance now stopped to offer a nod of acknowledgement. Engineers who had scoffed at his suggestion weeks before were now seeking his advice on systems they had once thought were out of his league. The janitor, it seemed, was no longer invisible. But Michael remained humble. He continued with his daily duties, wiping down floors, emptying trash bins, and making sure the hospital stayed clean. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't want it. What mattered to him was that the job was done, that the patients were safe, and that he had done something to help. One morning, as Michael quietly mopped the floor in the ICU, he overheard a conversation between Dr. Roberts and Dr. Fields, two of the hospital's most respected surgeons. "You know," Dr. Roberts said, "I still can't get over the fact that it was Michael who saved us. I keep thinking about all the times I walked past him, thinking he was just the janitor, just another guy with a broom." Dr. Fields nodded in agreement. It's easy to overlook someone when they don't fit the mold we expect. We all assumed he was just there to clean, to keep the hospital running in the background. But we were wrong. Michael's not just a janitor. He's a problem solver. He's an inventor. And he showed us just how much we've been missing by underestimating people like him. Michael didn't want to eavesdrop, but the words struck him deeply. He wasn't offended. Far from it. He had known the truth for a long time. It wasn't about being recognized for his work. It was about the realization that others had finally seen him for who he truly was. Not just a man with a mop, but a man with something more to offer. The realization spread beyond just the staff. In the days that followed, Michael found himself being approached by people from every department. The engineers, who had once brushed him off, were now seeking his input on the most minor of issues. One of the chief engineers stopped him one afternoon as he was heading to the maintenance closet. "Hey, Michael," the engineer said hesitantly. "I was wondering if you could take a look at something for me. It's nothing big, but I trust your judgment." Michael smiled, his face still as calm and humble as always. "Of course. What's the problem?" The engineer led him to a small piece of equipment that wasn't functioning properly. Michael bent down, examining the machine. Without a word, he reached into his toolbox and made a quick fix, something the engineer had missed entirely. "There you go," Michael said. "It's working now." The engineer stood there, stunned, then laughed nervously. "I guess I'll never doubt you again, Michael. You've got a knack for this stuff." "Thank you." As Michael walked back to his duties, a sense of quiet satisfaction washed over him. He had done his part, not just to save the hospital, but to change the way people saw him. He wasn't looking for special treatment. He wasn't looking for a promotion. What mattered to him was that they had finally seen the value in what he could offer. That evening, as the hospital quieted down and the staff began to head home, Michael finished his work as usual. He grabbed his mop and moved down the hallway, his steps slow and deliberate. The hospital felt different now. It wasn't just about the machinery or the patients. It was about the people who worked there. The ones who were always overlooked, the ones who did the unseen work, the ones who went unrecognized. As Michael passed the nurse's station, one of the nurses, a young woman who had once barely acknowledged him, looked up from her chart. She gave him a warm smile and nodded. "Thanks, Michael," she said, her voice sincere. "We really appreciate everything you've done." Michael simply smiled back, nodding in acknowledgement. "No problem," he said. "Just doing my job." He continued down the hall, passing other staff members who also now offered him nods of respect or quiet greetings. The janitor, the man who had once been invisible, was now a part of the team. He wasn't just the person who cleaned up after everyone. He was a part of the hospital's success, a crucial member of a team that had just learned a powerful lesson. The final scene of the day showed Michael leaving the hospital, his mop now clean and resting on his shoulder. He passed through the parking lot, his eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. For a brief moment, he paused, looking up at the building that had once overlooked him, that had once treated him like nothing more than a background figure. But now, the hospital had changed. And Michael had changed. He wasn't the same man who had walked through those doors years ago. The respect he had earned wasn't because of his title. It was because of his actions, his heart, and his willingness to step forward when no one else would. As he walked through the hospital's front door, heading home for the night, Michael glanced back at the glowing windows. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made a difference. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital's front entrance, Michael walked through the sliding doors for the last time that day. His work was far from over, but there was a sense of peace in his stride, a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had made a difference. Not just in the hospital systems, but in the way people saw each other. The last few days had been a whirlwind. From the moment he stepped in to fix the HVAC system, to the shocking realization of what he could offer, Michael had proven that talent wasn't bound by title or role. The hospital staff had learned that lesson well. They would never overlook someone based on their job description again. But the real change wasn't just in the hospital. It was in Michael, the quiet janitor who had walked through those doors unnoticed, day after day, was now a respected part of the team. His knowledge and skills had been recognized, but Michael wasn't looking for a crown. He wasn't waiting for accolades or a grand standing ovation. The only thing that mattered to him was that the patients were safe, the work had been done, and the hospital was running smoothly again. As Michael made his way down the hallway, he passed several nurses, doctors, and engineers who nodded in his direction, offering a smile or a quiet thank you. For once, no one was too busy to acknowledge the man who had changed everything. In the break room, a group of nurses were gathered, their voices low as they discussed the day's events. One nurse, who had been there when the crisis first started, spoke up. I still can't believe it was Michael who fixed it, she said, shaking her head. I've worked with him for years, and never once did I think he had that in him. Another nurse nodded. It's not just that he fixed it, it's how he did it. Calm, quiet, and without any fanfare. He just knew what needed to be done. How many of us overlooked him for so long? I guess it's a lesson for all of us, the first nurse said thoughtfully. It's so easy to underestimate people when you don't know their full potential. But we've got to stop doing that. We need to look beyond the titles, beyond the uniforms, and see what people can really do. The conversation lingered in the air long after they had left the break room. Michael had become a symbol of untapped potential, of hidden talent, of the real power that lies in the people we so often overlook. The lessons learned weren't just about fixing HVAC systems or solving technical problems. They were about recognizing the value in every individual, regardless of their role or title. Michael continued his work, as he always did, mopping floors and tidying up the spaces others took for granted. He wasn't looking for any more acknowledgement, any more praise. He had already gotten what he needed, the knowledge that his actions had made a lasting impact. He had proven to himself, and to those around him, that he was more than just a janitor. But it wasn't about the recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done. The hospital had changed. The staff had changed. And Michael? He was still the same. He didn't need accolades. He didn't need a title. What mattered to him was the people he worked with, the patients he helped, and the quiet sense of accomplishment that came from doing good work. Sometimes, the people who change the world the most are the ones you least expect. In every corner of our lives, there are unsung heroes. The people who step in when no one else can. The ones who do the work no one sees, who make the sacrifices no one notices, and who have the talents others overlook. Michael's story isn't just about one man's rise. It's about the danger of underestimating people based on their job titles, their roles, or their appearance. How many times have we walked past someone, not knowing the depth of their abilities? How many times have we failed to recognize the value in those around us, simply because they don't fit into the boxes we've created? Michael's story is a wake-up call, reminding us that greatness doesn't come with a title. It doesn't come with the right job or the right uniform. It comes from within. And sometimes, the most unexpected heroes are the ones who've been there all along. Who are you overlooking in your own life? The quiet person in the corner, the unsung hero in your workplace, your community, your family? Don't forget to look closer. You might just be missing someone who could change everything. Share your thoughts. Who are the heroes in your life who go unrecognized? Who have you overlooked? Leave a comment below and share the stories of the quiet heroes who deserve to be seen. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire. The screen fades to black as uplifting music plays softly in the background. The final words linger in the air, reminding viewers of the power of recognition, the importance of seeing beyond the surface, and the incredible potential hidden in the most unexpected places. Don't forget, every story has a hero, even if they're hiding in plain sight.